Well, hello and welcome back to Supposedly Fun. I am Greg here today to do my wrap-up for the month of December. I almost didn't do a reading wrap-up for this month because, with the end of year, I'm going to be doing my favorite reads of the year, my least favorite reads of the year, so I thought that's going to be a lot. But there are some books that I will not be covering in those videos that I did read in the month of December, and I wanted a chance to talk about them. So here we are, I'm going to do it. I'm not going to get into things like how these match up with my goals because, again, I'm going to be wrapping all of that up. So let's get right into the titles. The first book I finished in the month of December was The Shining by Stephen King, which I have talked about at length. I even did an comparison of the book and its film adaptation by Stanley Kubrick. I will link that down below. The next one was Talking to Strangers by Malcolm Gladwell, which I absolutely hated. Left a rant review of that one. I will link that down below as well. Now we get into some of the ones that I haven't really spoken about because those were ones that I talked about at length already. The next one was Furious Hours by Casey Sepp. This is a book about Harper Lee and a case that she tried to write about, kind of thinking she would do her own in cold blood. If you are at all familiar with the story of Capote or just Truman Capote in general, you know that Harper Lee went with him. He was her childhood friend and helped him investigate the killings that eventually became the book In Cold Blood. And she had it in her mind that she would do something like that. So Furious Hours is, what I don't like about the book is that it feels like two separate books that have been kind of Frankensteined into one, because you are sort of introduced to Harper Lee very briefly in the beginning, just that she's in a courtroom, and it mentions that she is writing a book about it. And then you just go into the story of the case that she will eventually be investigating. And then, so you spend roughly half the book on just the case, and Harper Lee does not factor into it at all. And then you get to Harper Lee, and it goes back and tells the story of her childhood, and how she met Truman Capote as a child, and how she eventually came to write To Kill a Mockingbird, which was published, I believe, after it was getting ready to be published, as she was helping Truman Capote investigate what would then become In Cold Blood, and how she dealt with success, which was not great, and then how she came to investigate this particular case and why it caught her interest and what she wanted to say about it. And then so then we go back to the case and find out a little bit her investigation of it, and then it takes another kind of left turn and talks about how her dissatisfaction with writing and the problems that had emerged in Harper Lee's life ultimately kept her from writing a book about it and publishing anything else in her lifetime. So it just feels like everything in the book is interesting, but the way it's structured makes it feel like a bunch of different books that have been grafted together. And that part is a little bit frustrating. To me, the most interesting thing is that, the case itself reveals a lot about the South and the complicated relationships that it has to race. And that's all interesting, and the way the justice system interacts with all of those complicated feelings about race. But obviously the most interesting parts are actually about Harper Lee. And one thing, I knew the story of Go Set a Watchman, which was published recently, but I hadn't known that Harper Lee's original intent with To Kill a Mockingbird was to write a much more complex view of race in the South. And part of why there's that kind of whiplash idea that when Go Set a Watchman was published, a lot of people were surprised, how could Atticus Finch be a racist? Well, the original intent was to show that good people, or otherwise good people, had really problematic approaches to race. Like, there were people in the South who would say, oh, well, there shouldn't be slavery, but I don't think they should have the right to vote. Or, segregation is good, but not in my neighborhood. Things like that. And so she would see all of these people who had those beliefs, and she wanted to get that across in her books, or in her work. And with the help of an editor, she ended up zooming in on the portion of Go Set a Watchman that was sort of like a flashback to Scout's childhood, and that became To Kill a Mockingbird. And To Kill a Mockingbird, with the help of the editor, became much more simplified and had a sort of, I think it's accurate, but it is a much more simplified version of race, where there are good people, there are bad people, and there's not so much in between. And Harper Lee kind of resented that. So she was interested in this case because she thought it would get at a lot of those more interesting things. And part of why she failed was that the people who had helped her shape To Kill a Mockingbird were not in her life anymore. Her publisher, I believe, had died. Or her editor had died. That part is all really interesting. I think this is a book that is definitely worth reading. I don't think it fits together all that great just because of the structure, but it's still all very interesting, and I really enjoyed it a lot. A book that I think is a lot less successful is American Predator. Now, this book is subtitled The Hunt for the Most Meticulous Serial Killer of the 21st Century. It's by Maureen Callahan. Now, my problem with this book is that, first of all, it talks about, right there in the title, I think it's a marketing thing more than a Maureen Callahan thing. They say the most meticulous serial killer of the 21st century. Well, he is meticulous in the beginning of his serial killing career, but he's certainly not by the end. He gets cocky. He starts craving the fame and recognition that would only come by being caught, so he's not actually that meticulous toward the end. In fact, he only ends up not being caught for so long because police just didn't catch on to him. But once they did, there was ample evidence if anybody had paid attention to it. So that doesn't jibe very well. And so the book opens with a woman who goes missing one night. She is working in one of those coffee carts that you drive up to and then get your coffee and leave. And so she goes missing, and the book is very much about her disappearance and the ways police find. It spends a lot of time on how police are trying to find her and who this woman is, and then they eventually find a suspect who did it. And once they have the suspect, all of these other crimes in the past come out. And the problem is, so much time is spent on that, you don't really see where the book is going because there's no setup to the book. You don't find it. It seems like it's just a case of a missing woman and the search for that, and you don't understand the stakes because there's no introduction to it. What I like about this approach is that it makes it feel like you are directly living in the perspective of the police who are investigating the case, because you find out details about why this disappearance is significant and who the person who actually murdered this woman actually is, as the police do. However, it's not handled in a way that's really interesting enough to, I think, really hold your attention all that well. I think this book really would have benefited from either raising those stakes or giving you a lot more information up front so you know where it's going and you understand why it might be spending so much of this time, because otherwise it just feels a little bit bizarre. So I don't think American Predator was all that successful as a book, which is a shame because I think it could have had a lot going for it. And then I finished Belonging by Nora Krug. This is about, the subtitle is The German Reckons with History and Home. So Nora Krug's family is German, obviously. She was born there. She immigrated to the United States. And she becomes curious about what her family was doing during World War II and where they stood politically. So she investigates into it. And what she finds is that although a lot of her family members either did not want to talk about World War II or the things that they believed and would talk about turned out to either be untrue or more complicated than it seemed in the beginning. For instance, they see her grandfather as sort of a conscientious objector, but it turns out he actually joined the Nazi Party. But then when she further investigates into that, she finds out he joined the Nazi Party because it was really the only way he could purchase a business to support his family. So what I really like about this book is that if you know me, you know I love a book where the author is kind of interrogating either their family or their history or their own feelings about things, and this book has that in spades. And I think it's all very interesting. And I think the World War II angle is really interesting because you get these ideas, you want your family to be noble, but sometimes it's just not the case, and sometimes things are much more complicated than you would like them to be. And one thing I really also appreciate about this book is that it talks about how difficult it is to piece together history, because she'll never really know what her grandfather was thinking and what his motivations were, because she never got to talk to him, and because her own family was so adamant about avoiding the topic that they just didn't talk about it. So I really recommend this book. I really enjoyed this book. I think there are some flaws in the putting together of this book. It is a graphic memoir, and I'm just looking for an example. There are a lot of instances where it's actually not that hard, not that easy to go with the flow of the book. You kind of have to figure out what you're looking at and where to read next. And that's a little bit jarring. There are a lot of sections where there's a block, and what I'm looking for an example. Okay, here's one. So you can see this photo is in the middle of the page, and the text flows from left to right, so you have to keep reading across the image, which isn't really the biggest thing, but for some reason Nora Krug really loves this gimmick. She does it a lot. I mean, again and again and again, especially as you get toward the end. And it just, I don't know. So the biggest problems I have with this book are with the way it's laid out, but it's very interesting, and I really recommend it. I just think it's really interesting. So there's that. Then I listened to the audiobook of Hunger by Roxane Gay. This is a memoir in which she talks about her body and the ways she feels about her body and the ways in which society feels about her body as someone who is overweight. She was raped at the age of 12, and after that she started overeating in a way of actively trying to make herself unattractive to other people so people wouldn't want to pay attention to her body, and it became a lifelong struggle for her. And in no small part due to the fact that she wasn't really dealing with the trauma. She never told her family until she was an adult. She actually didn't tell her family until after she published a book in which she discussed having been raped at age 12. It's a good book. One thing I really like about it is I love experiencing worldviews that are outside of mine, and this is not my experience of the world. You know, Roxane Gay is a woman of color, a lesbian, and a larger woman. I am white, male, gay, but, you know, and largely for most of my life have been, you know, thin and I guess you would say conventionally, marginally attractive. So I have never had to deal with the things that she had to deal with. And I think what's interesting is about halfway through the book, I was having problems with some of the arguments that she was making. And I had to stop and interrogate why I was having problems and whether or not I was having problems because Roxane Gay is wrong or because my experience of the world has been so different from her that I just can't fathom. So I reached out to two people, a friend of mine named Elizabeth, who I used to work with at Borders, who was not on BookTube, and Matthew Sharapa. And both of whom had read this book or other things by Roxane Gay, and they were both really helpful at pointing me back toward what Roxane Gay is actually trying to do in the book and what she was trying to say, and ways in which my experience of the world was maybe inhibiting me from getting at it a lot. So I really appreciate this book from that perspective because it really did make me think a lot, and it really challenged me in a lot of different ways. I do think there are still some areas that are problematic. Like my friend Elizabeth explained a lot about Roxane Gay's process of writing and what she has said in later interviews about what she was trying to do with this book and how hard it was for her to write this book, because she was trying to exercise a lot of demons as she was writing, which is a difficult process to begin with. But my friend Elizabeth even pointed out, it's like, well, but if you need that additional context, then the book probably fails, at least in some way. And Matthew said something kind of similar. It's like, I believe what he said was, in Roxane Gay's writing, sometimes she's not great at getting what her point is across. So you have to stop and try to figure it out. And I guess I did like the process of stopping and figuring it out, but I think it's definitely worth reading, but I do think there are some problems and some flaws in it. But I think this is something that is really important for people to do, especially, you know, white males like me, who grew up with a very specific view of the world. I think it's important to stop and challenge yourself and experience something different. And not only that, but if you're having trouble with it, to try to stop and say, why am I not believing this, or why am I struggling to understand her point of view so much? And the part that I was struggling with, for full context, she talks about reality TV and makeovers and things like that, and how they fat shame people, which I absolutely believe is true, and they adhere to this very stereotypical idea of what is pretty and what is attractive, and they enforce those notions as they tell people to get thin. But she really objects to the idea that people are told that they will be healthier if they are skinny, and where I was struggling with that part, like I was with her until she got to that. I've gained weight in the last year, a lot. I am currently at the heaviest I've ever, not the heaviest I've ever been, because I was at the same weight I am now when I was 21 and going to the gym like a madman and in really great shape. So the difference is I'm at the same weight I was then, but back then it was muscle and now it's not. And in the last year, as I've gained this weight, I have had significantly less energy. I've had a lot of trouble moving around. I've developed like an acid reflux problem that makes it difficult for me to sleep, or more difficult because I already have really bad sleeping problems. So it feels like she's rejecting the notion that being skinnier is being healthier. And I know I have a cousin who was greatly obese at a certain point, and she ended up having gastric bypass because her attempts to lose weight weren't working. And yes, wanting to feel pretty was part of that. But at the same time, she had a daughter who was only about 4 or 5 years old at the time. And she couldn't play with her daughter. If her daughter was on the floor, she couldn't sit on the floor and play with her daughter. If her daughter was running, she couldn't chase after her. And she felt like she was missing out on a lot of those things. So it feels like, it felt like Roxane was trying to deny there are potential health benefits. And that anyone who says you could be healthier if you are thinner is fat shaming. And I think that can be true, but it depends so much on context. And so that's part of what I was really struggling with. And the other part that I was really struggling with was that then she also talks about how uncomfortable going to the gym is for her. And I'm with her. I understand that. When you are not in shape, you feel like everybody's looking at you. You feel like you're on display. You feel like you're being judged. But she talks about looking at the people who are in shape, working out, and feeling disgusted and being disgusted by them and their pursuit of being thin. And then what I was having trouble with is she's doing to them what she doesn't want them to do with her. She's making assumptions about them based on their appearance and what they are doing, and assuming that they are making themselves unhappy or torturing themselves by working out. When in my past, when I have worked out and started seeing results, I feel happy, I feel energized. And yes, you could say that is partially because you feel like you are attractive and therefore more worthy. But I just feel better about myself when I'm doing those things. And she talks about her personal trainer, and she judges him really harshly because he eats chicken as his main source of protein. And she's like, he's missing out on all of these spices and other foods and things like that. When a lot of the people that I know get, because they appreciate the results that they're getting by doing that, so that maybe he doesn't feel like he's missing out. So those are some of the areas that I was struggling. And I'm glad that I have more perspective on the subject now. But those are the areas I was having some hard time with in this book. I definitely recommend it. It has been an exercise for me in kind of interrogating myself and how I respond to things and how I feel about things and how my experience can be very different from somebody else's. And I think that's something we all need to do. Not just react to something and say, like talking to strangers. Yes, I reacted very badly to that book. I hated that book. But in asking myself why, I had a much easier time saying, look, these are all the problems that I have with it. In this book, I actually had to reach out to other people and say, well, why am I reacting to this in this way? And I think that is something we always need to do. And that's part of why I love doing like book reviews and talking to you guys about things like this, because it forces me to think about my reaction to things. And I'm a nerd. I love that. So anyway, the other thing I have not finished, so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time talking about it. I'm almost done with Little Women, the first book. So this is a buddy read with Britta Bowler. We are both desperately trying to finish this by the end of the year. She is much closer to finishing than I am, so I have to wrap up this video so I can get back to it. I'm almost done with this one. Really loving it. I think if I can manage to finish this year, it might not be on my list of favorites, but it might be on my also rans. So once I finish this, what we have discovered is that in Europe, you usually get Little Women is usually sold as book 1 and book 2, and in America, it's just the first book. So the sequel is packaged with it in Europe. So I had to grab myself a copy of Little Women that has all 3 books and some really tiny type. But once I finish this, I'm going to try to dive into book 2 and get that finished. So will I finish in time for the end of the year? I don't know. I think I will definitely have this done by the end of the year, and I'll talk more about it later. I did just see the new movie adaptation, and I just watched the 1994 adaptation as well. I will be doing comparisons of the book to film adaptations of those as well, but that's definitely going to be in January. So I think I'll finish this. Hopefully I'll get to this today and tomorrow. We shall see. But anyway, that's what I have read in the month of December. If you've read any of these and you have thoughts, I would be very interested if you have if you want to tell me I'm crazy about my reaction to Roxane Gay. Drop a comment down below, please. Let's talk about it. And I would love to hear what you read in the month of December. I will be doing my wrap up real soon for the year, and that's exciting. Doing my goals for next year. Looking forward to sharing those with you. And yeah, so as always, I really appreciate you taking the time to watch this video. If you have chosen to follow along, thank you for that. And I will see you next time. Until then, happy reading.